Good morning, friends. I am Swapnil Gosavi, and today we are going to continue the lecture series on history of English literature. And today we will start on the Puritan age, and the Puritan age was between 1603 to 1660. So, at the beginning, we will talk about the political and social background. So we find that in 1603, King Elizabeth was passed away, and King James VI of Scotland became also James I of England. A glance at the genealogical table will show that he had descended through the female line from Henry VIII, Elizabeth's grandfather. Henry VIII was Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, and his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was a Catholic. He was first married to the Dauphin. The Dauphin dying, Mary returned to Scotland. She was a great beauty, and being still young, married her cousin Henry Stuart. Darnley became jealous of an Italian musician, Rizzio, Rizzio, because of his intimacy with the queen and had him openly murdered. Encouraged by this rift between the queen and her husband James Bothwell. James Bothwell was an unscrupulous Scot. He was murdered Darnley, and within 3 months of the murder, the queen married the murderer. This conduct of the queen shocked the people who already hated her on account of her opposition to Presbyterianism, the national religion. And her mother, Mary of Guise, was a French Catholic. She had, as regent, done her best to stem the tide of Reformation in Scotland, but had failed. The queen succeeded no better. Her position becoming desperate, she sought shelter in England. There she was kept a close prisoner for 19 years. But as she became the center of Catholic plots against Elizabeth, the latter had no alternative but to have her beheaded. Her infant son James had been left behind in Scotland, where he was brought up a Presbyterian. He occupied his mother's throne as James VI. As he was the only heir to the English throne after Elizabeth's death, he weighted the two crowns and became James I of England. Though James brought up in the Presbyterian religion, he had no difficulty in accepting Anglicanism. The troubles which started almost immediately after his accession and which plagued England for more than half a century arose over two issues. First was religion and the right of the king to raise money without the consent of parliament. During Elizabeth's reign, the principal opponents of the Reformed Church had been Catholics. In the new reign, they made a desperate attempt to blow up the king and both houses of parliament by hatching what is known as the gunpowder plot in 1605. However, the plot was discovered in time and the conspirators were executed. The Puritans, who had been comparatively quiet so far, now took the lead and brought religious controversy to the forefront. They regarded the ceremonies in the church as popish. They wanted the king to abolish them. The king did not yield. The foreign policy of James further alienated a large number of his subjects. He wished to be a peacemaker in Europe and with this purpose, he attempted to arrange a match between his son Charles and the Infanta. Infanta. Infanta was the eldest daughter of the King of Spain. The English hated Spain. They remembered the reign of Bloody Mary and the Spanish Armada. However, the princess jilted Charles as she too was a Catholic. The marriage was no less distasteful to the people than the Spanish match which had fallen through. They feared that she might convert Charles or at any rate bring forth Catholic heirs to the English throne. The second issue led to a more bitter quarrel between king and parliament. Though the Tudors had been despots, they had always treated parliament with respect. They carried it with them in all matters of national policy. James wanted to ignore parliament. He advanced the novel claim to rule by divine right. In other words, he held that kings were the viceroys of gods. It was a sin to disobey them. Thus, James and after him, Charles thought it beneath their dignity to consult Parliament. Parliament, on its part, was determined to maintain the constitution according to which it alone had the power to grant money. James and Charles both tried to raise money by taxes without leave of parliament. Matters came to a head early in the reign of Charles, and he was forced to accept the Petition of Right. Actually, the Petition of Right was a document which declared that taxes not sanctioned by Parliament were illegal. It was a bitter bill. It was a bitter pill for the king to swallow, and it is not difficult to see why he hated Parliament. Having quarrelled with all the three parliaments he called during the first 4 years of his reign, he decided to dispense with Parliament altogether, and for 11 years, from 1629 to 1640, Charles ruled without Parliament. This period, called the 11 Years' tyranny, was marked by ruthless suppression of parliamentary leaders and other opponents of the government through farcical trials by special prerogative courts like the Star Chamber and the Ecclesiastical Court of High Commission. To obtain money, he adopted several illegal taxation measures which roused great resentment. In 1634, he imposed ship money. Ship money is a tax on coastal towns which was formerly paid in wartime in lieu of ships for defense. As it was imposed in peacetime, it roused great opposition. A Puritan squire whose name was John Hampden, Hampden. He refused to pay on the ground that it had not been sanctioned by Parliament. He was tried and condemned by the judges who were afraid of the king. The religious situation was aggravated by the appointment of Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. Laud's High Church or pro Catholic policy was, in fact, the real cause of the Civil War. He enforced ritual in churches. He banned Puritan or non-conformist worship outside them. This the Puritans found intolerable, and many migrated to America. Instigated by Lord the King, instigated by the Lord Laud, the King imposed Anglican worship on the Scottish Church. This inflamed the Scots who signed a solemn league and covenant with God by which they pledged themselves to defend Presbyterianism. They rose in armed revolt, and Scottish armies marched upon England. Thus threatened, Charles was compelled to call Parliament in order to raise money for troops to defend England. The Parliament, which Charles called in 1640 on the advice of his chief minister Stratford, lasted only 3 weeks, and it is called the Short Parliament. It refused the money wanted by the king and was summarily dismissed. But as the Scots had already marched into Yorkshire, Charles called Parliament again the same year. This is known as the Long Parliament, since it continued for nearly 20 years. It was this parliament which saw the king beheaded. With the money granted by it, Charles bribed the Scots out of the country. Under the leadership of Pym, Hampden, and Cromwell, the Long Parliament annulled the illegal acts of the king, impeached and executed Lord and the Earl of Stafford, and abolished the much hated Star Chamber and the Court of the High Commission. What ultimately precipitated the Civil War was the hot headedness of the king. Infuriated against Parliament, he went down to the House of Commons to effect the illegal arrest of Pym, Hampden, and three others by main force. But having been warned beforehand, they had escaped. The Parliament was now convinced that Charles could not be trusted, and the issue had to be decided by arms. The king fled to the north, and civil war began. The Anglicans and the Catholics, who hated the Puritans, rallied round the king. These royalists were called cavaliers, while the Puritan soldiers are called roundheads from their close cropped hair. Parliament secured the help of Scotland by signing the Covenant to establish Presbyterianism in England. It is not necessary for us to go into details of the Civil War. It threw up heroes on both sides. The king was worthily supported by his nephew Prince Rupert and the Highland royalist Montrose, but they were defeated by Oliver Cromwell. The parliamentary leader. The highlights of the war were the battles of Marston Moor, Naseby, and Preston. Charles surrendered himself to the Scots, who made him over to Parliament. It is important to remember that the trial and execution of the king was the decision of Cromwell, his independent party. This Puritan sect, also called the Congregationalists, this Puritan sect believed in the freedom of churches and allowed all sects to worship as they pleased. On the other hand, Parliament was composed mostly of Presbyterians who were for a uniform system of Presbyterianism and would not permit such toleration. Neither Parliament nor the people in general wanted the king's trial or execution. Therefore, Cromwell purged Parliament of its moderate Presbyterians and forced the truncated Parliament, or rump as it came to be called, to bring the king to trial. He was condemned and his head cut off on 30 January 1649. The pathos of the beheading scene was heightened by the king's dignified bearing. The execution was looked upon as a murder, and the king a martyr. But England was helpless and submitted to the rule of Cromwell and his army. It was different with Ireland and Scotland. Both rose in favor of the king's son, but both were crushed by Cromwell. They were united to England in a commonwealth, as the rump showed no inclination to dissolve. Cromwell dissolved it by force in 1653. Though he called several parliaments after this, he did not get on with any of them. Weary of parliaments, he took over the reins of the government in his own hands and ruled as military dictator till his death in 1658. His son Richard Cromwell, who took over, was incompetent, and for more than a year, England faced a crisis until General Monk, who emerged as the most powerful leader of the army, called a free parliament. The Convention Parliament this declared the monarchy and in 1660 invited the beheaded king's son to the throne of England as Charles II. Ahead, we find that on the other side of the balance sheet, the Puritans made themselves odious by their bigotry, narrowness, austere living, and stern morality. In their attempt to make people good by force, they closed the theaters and they frowned upon dance, music, the arts, and other innocent pleasures. Ironically enough, the freedom fighters had themselves become tyrants. It is not surprising that the people in general came to hate the Puritans intensely and they were happy to get rid of their yoke. And here we can conclude the political and social background of the Puritan age. Yes. Now, here we should talk about literature in this era. So, firstly, we will talk about poetry. Yes, it is very important. So, no single political title fits the period of English literature from the death of Elizabeth to the Restoration, as its literature is dominated by the giant figure of Milton. It is convenient as well as appropriate to call it the age of Milton or the Puritan age. This literature is an extension of the Elizabethan and is really part of the great Elizabethan age. The term decadent is sometimes applied to it, but it is hardly justified. If it is applied at all, it is subject to such large reservations that it is rendered nugatory. The drama certainly declined, tragedy degenerating into horror plays, and comedy into the trivial and coarse. Whether or not it deserved this fate, the drama came to an end with the closing of the theatres in 1642. In poetry, the decline is discernible only in the metaphysical school, though it is largely counterbalanced by the achievements of the Cavalier poets, to say nothing of those of Milton. In prose, the performance of this period is even greater than that of Elizabethan age proper. As against Lilly, Bacon, and Hooker, we have the authorized version of the Bible and such magnificent prose writers as Burton, Jeremy Taylor, Thomas Browne, and Milton himself. Though not decadent, the literature of the period nevertheless has characteristics which correspond to the middle age of man's life. The spirit is the same, but it has lost some of its youthful vigor. The exuberant imagination of the Elizabethan age, proper which had in the full tide of Renaissance, overflowed in spontaneous reckless, abundance, and this poetry gave the place to learning, deliberation, and melancholy reflection. As inspiration waned, its place was supplied by intellectuality, imitation, and exaggeration. The very defects of the Elizabethans came to be recognized as excellences to be imitated. This is exemplified in the artificiality, exaggeration, and obscurity in Donne and his metaphysical school. Another factor which influenced literature in this era was the disunity of the country. The struggle between king and the parliament destroyed the unity of the nation, which had been held together by Queen Elizabeth. This division of the country into two hostile camps is reflected in literature. Instead of being national, it became partisan. So we have cavalier poets and roundhead poets. So here, what was the poetry in this era ahead? So we have seen how the dramatists of this period followed either Shakespeare or Ben Jonson. However, the poets had the choice not of two but three masters. First one Spenser, second one Ben Jonson, and third one John Donne. The influence of Spenser was supreme during the reign of James. He came almost to an end at his death, surviving only in Milton. Ben Jonson and John Donne influenced the poets of Caroline and Commonwealth periods. The Spenserians are descriptive, while the schools of Ben Jonson and Donne are lyrical. So here now Spenserians, the poets under whose influence the writers tried to compose the verses. Spenserians, Giles Fletcher, Phineas Fletcher, William Browne, George Wither. The brothers Giles and Phineas Fletcher were both Cambridge men and pastors. They acknowledged Spenser as their master. They wrote long allegorical poems in modified Spenserian stanzas. Giles' Christ, Victory, and Triumph the anticipates Milton's epic in its manner, though in manner it is a brilliant imitation of Spenser. Phineas Fletcher's Purple Iceland is a much longer but prosy allegorical of the human body. Browne and Wither were Oxford men, and they were friends who had strong affinities with Spenser, though they did not use his stanza. They wrote in couplet. They wrote in couplet, mostly octosyllabic couplets, with sentences running on beyond the second line, so that the rhymes get lost in a rapid flow of verse. Such run on or enjambed couplets tend to excessive facility, looseness, and volubility. In short poems, enjambment does not much matter, but in a long poem, such as Chamberlain's narrative romance Pharaonida, it leads to incoherence. This is a special feature of the poets of the Caroline period who write in couplets, and he is regarded as a mark of decadence in prosody. The pioneers of the classical age were Denham and Waller. Both Browne and Wither wrote delightful pastoral poems which link them up with the lake poets. With their genuine feeling for nature and the countryside, they ornate, their ornate, pictorial and sensuous presentation of it, and their fluent music, they anticipate kids. The pictorial sweetness is more marked in Wither, though because he was a Puritan. Wither was a Puritan. He was for a long time abused and neglected because of their facility in couplets. Both wrote voluminously but are readable only in selections. Nobody today could read with patience Browne's Britannia's Pastorals which owes its fame more to the title than to any intrinsic merit. He is remembered specially for the Syrian song. Whether is remembered for such songs as Shall I Wasting in Despair. The choice in which Vida praises, the title of the poem is The Choice, in which he praises the rose and the pretty and moving a widow hymn. Now there is the school of Ben Jonson and John Donne. The important thing to notice in the poetry of the Caroline period is the predominance of the lyric. With the exception of Milton's epic, there are no great poems. Of course, there were ambitious poets who designed poems on the epic scale, such as D. Avenet's poem Gondibart, Cowley's Dravidias, and Chamberlain's Faronida, but they were failures. So the charm of the poetry of this period lies in its lyrics. This is no departure from the Elizabethan tradition, whose inspiration was essentially lyrical. Indeed, Spenser did not practice the lyric to any large extent, though he wrote a large body of sonnets which are also a class of the lyric. We have seen that the Elizabethan lyrics were issued in collections of the type of Tottel's Miscellany, though such collections continued in the 17th century. The practice of poets issuing their productions separately became more common. The lyric in their hands becomes frank and realistic. The fantastic idealism of the Petrarchan tradition gives place to sober realism. Not that the Caroline lyric is without the Elizabethan conceit. The conceit is there, but the lyric on the whole is simpler, clearer, smoother, and more graceful. The lyric writers fall into two groups according to they followed Ben Jonson and John Donne. In some cases, the same poet combines the elements of both masters, and it is utile trying to disentangle them. Generally speaking, the writers of secular lyrics, uh, for example, cavalier lyrics, as they are called, yes, secular lyrics is called cavalier lyrics. These cavalier lyrics owe their inspire on to Ben Jonson and the writers of religious lyrics called metaphysical lyrics, whose owner was Donne. Secular lyrics or cavalier lyrics, head was Ben Jonson, and religious lyrics or metaphysical lyrics, whose head was John Donne. Now, Ben Jonson and cavalier lyrics or cavalier poetry, we must discuss about them. Ben Jonson and cavalier lyrics. So Ben Jonson and cavalier poetry or cavalier lyrist, we must talk about it. So Ben Jonson, the more famous as a dramatist, but he also composed charming lyrics. Being devoted to classics, he followed the patterns of Horace, Virgil, Catullus, and other great writers of antiquity. He loved order and regularity in form and simplicity and clarity in sense. Though classicist, he was not without romantic feeling which breaks out now and then in his famous song Drink to me only with thine eyes and I will pledge with mine. He loved simplicity and did not approve of excessive adornment. His classical restraint and careful craftsmanship exerted a healthy influence on his followers, and the followers were called the Cavalier poets. Their lyrics are simple, clear, and graceful, avoiding the extremes of over ornaments of Spencer on the one hand and the tortured wit and obscurity of Donne on the other. In spirit, they are pagan. They express the hedonistic philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. So they sing of wine, women, and song. So here are some cavalier poets such as Herrick, Carew, Suckling, and Lovelace. These four famous cavalier poets whom about we will talk here. So the greatest and most popular of the cavalier lyrists was Herrick. He was a Cambridge MA who after a riotous youth took orders when he was nearly 40. He was deprived of his living when Parliament won but was reinstated after the restoration. His fame depends on secular poems which appeared in the collection called Hesperides. This also contained some divine poems or noble numbers. The poems are simplicity itself, their excellence consisting in dainty phrasing. The burden of the poems is the brevity of human life and its joys. And his most famous poem is Corina's Going a Maying. Here, Carew is another personality. Uh, he shows the influence of Donne in some of the extravagant conceits. A typical courtier, he was refined and dashing libertine with a taste and talents for poetry, and his poems show meticulous craftsmanship. They are highly polished and elegant. He is now remembered chiefly for some of his songs too. Yes, and we find that Suckling and Lovelace are mentioned together because of the similarity of their circumstances as well as of the fate that overtook them. Both were staunch royalists and ruined themselves in the royalist cause. Both were very rich, brilliant, and witty. Suckling was a spendthrift and libertine, while Lovelace was remarkable for the beauty of his person and virtue. Both had a turn for poetry, but neither of them was careful poet. Suckling's love poems are full of fun and frivolity. Lovelace has won immortality by a couple of short pieces which are as serious and sincere as Suckling's are frivolous and conventional. And is one of the famous poem is To Lucasta, by written by Lovelace. And there was another person, Andrew Marvell, should ordina fly be classed with Milton as a Puritan poet. Marvell was Milton's assistant as Latin secretary in the Cromwell government. Marvell was a great admirer of the dictator. He remained inflexibly opposed of the government after the restoration, but curiously enough, Marvell's verse is anything but puritanical. As a poet, Marvell was in sympathy with the opposite party. Uh, he exhibits the best qualities of the Cavalier poets. His poetry combines the clarity and grace of Ben Jonson with the metaphysical wit of Donne. This is best shown in his poem To His Coy Mistress, and really, To His Coy Mistress is one of the best poem, not best poem, but marvelous poem in the English literature or English poetry. Ahead we find that Marvel's frankly sensuous enjoyment of nature is seen in his poem Thoughts in a Garden. After that, Marvel's Horatian Ode on Cromwell, and in it he stops to pay tribute to Charles I. And ahead we find that Marvel is the most attractive poet of the age. Uh, that is great. And ahead we find the most important point, that is uh, Done and Metaphysical School. Yes, metaphysical poetry. John Donne and Metaphysical School means we can talk here metaphysical poetry. So it is the most important school in the history of English poetry. Uh, Even more powerful than Ben Jonson's was the influence of John Donne. The lifetime of John Donne was 1573 to 1631. Wild and dissipated in his youth, Donne took orders late in life and rose to be dean of St. Paul's. St. Paul's was a devout churchman. He was a great preacher of sermons. His early poems are outspokenly erotic and sensual. They were published only after his death, though they had been in private circulation in MS. His divine poems are equally passionate in expressing his complex and deep religious emotion. John Donne was a rebel in poetry. Impatient of convention, Donne was revolted against the whole Spenserian tradition in matter as well as in manner. John Donne despised not only its allegory, pastoralism, and romantic chivalry, but also its overrich style and smooth versification. He thought Spenser's chivalric or platonic love a humbug. He decided to treat love as a physical appetite honestly and realistically. And as he did not like Spenser's heavily brooded language and the monotonous music of his stanza, he deliberately adopted a colloquial language and rough and crabbed meter. John Donne was undoubtedly possessed of great poetic gifts, but he aims at originality. He achieved only novelty. There are passages of great and grave beauty both in his love poems and in his divine poems, but usually they are embedded in a bog of philosophical disquisition of such subtlety that the reader's head begins to reel RWEL as he follows him through the twists and turns of the argument. It was this habit of philosophizing, of leading a subject into strange, dim, and unexpected vistas of thought that earned him the title of metaphysical. A good example of the poem is Ecstasy. The ecstasy of union of two souls in love is a simple enough idea, but it is tortured into such ethereal shapes that only a reader gifted with a special sixth sense can grasp them. The key to Jordan's poetry lies in a peculiar makeup of his personality. He was intensely, even violently passionate. He was at the same time given to intense and melancholy meditation. This blend of passion and thought, this blend of passion and thought, this integrated sensibility they maintain. Uh, it is the distinguishing quality of John Donne's poetry. But this sensibility is not peculiar to Donne. Poetic sensibility is a complex thing, a compound of thought and feeling. No poet's sensibility is either emotion alone or thought alone. Thought and feeling are inextricably mixed, though their proportion may vary according to the subject or the mood of the poet. The true explanation of Donne's puzzle seems to be that when the thought element in him takes over, it carries him off his feet. This uncontrolled thought leads to Rhapsody, Rhapsody, and raving. Add to this the further fact that he had something of the exhibitionist in him. This led him to disgusting realism in his portrayal of love and to extravagant hyperboles and preposterous consists in his philosophical speculations. In one of his poems, he describes with relish the details of his going to bed with his mistress. In another, he threatens to visit his disdainful mistress as a ghost after his death. This apparition will witness the shameful discomfiture of the woman trying in vain to wake up her new lover so that she may have more. All these things are in bad taste and show a petrid, not a poetic mind. The only poems in which he shows real tenderness are those addressed to his wife. In others, his attitude to women is brutally cynical. His Mandrake song, famous for its fantasticism, his Mandrake song is a good illustration of this. Unsavory realism, hyperboles, and fantasticism do not exhaust Dunn's devices to arrest attention. John Donne employs many others, abrupt transition from one extreme to other, juxtaposition of the trivial and the sublime, the colloquial and the grandiloquent. So there are some metaphysical poets whom about we must talk. So the newness of John Donne's poetry strongly appealed to the tastes of the time, and for a whole generation from 1630 to 1660, the metaphysical style was widely, if not universally, practiced. We have seen how even the secular cavalier poets who called themselves sons of Bain were not without traces of Donne's influence. The direct descendants of Donne, however, were the religious poets Herbert Crashaw, Vaughan, and Traherne. In this group of religious metaphysicals, George Herbert is the central figure. His humility, self effacement, simple piety, and perfect Christian charity find plain, direct, and harmonious expression in the collection of his poems called The Temple. His metaphysical conceits are well controlled and easy to follow. He has neither the brilliance of Crashaw nor the depth of Vaughan, but is on that account perhaps more successful than both as a religious poet. His poems The Pulley, Puey, and Love, which may be read in any anthology, are enough to illustrate the quite soothing quality of Herbert's poetry. There was another poet, Crashaw, and Crashaw was a Catholic poet. He is nearest to John Donne in fantastic conceits. He is the most brilliant of this group, but his hyperboles border on the fatuous and the absurd. The eyes of Saint Mary Magdalene in the poem The Weeper uh, are described very nice, like walking baths, compendious ocean. Their tears are the cream of the Milky Way. So, how you are Crashaw's hymn to Saint Teresa is the most explosive effusion of devotional passion in all English religious poetry. Most of his verse is religious, but some of his best poems are secular. The most interesting of these is his whimsical, uh, in single inverted comma, wishes to his supposed mistress. Single inverted comma complete. After that, there was a Henry Vaughan. He has deeper thought. but he is not very artistic in expression. Vaughan, Vaughan is illustrated in such poems as The Retreat. In this poem, Vaughan anticipates Wordsworth's Immortality Ode, and the next poet is a Traherne, and his work was discovered only at the beginning of the present century. He is a minor Vaughan, both in his mysticism and in his reminiscence of childhood. So the what is the meaning of metaphysical? The word metaphysical, it is also discussed here. So before taking our leave of the metaphysical school, a word must be said about the term itself. It was first used by John Donne. Sorry, it was first used for John Donne by John Dryden. It was later applied to him and his school by Dr. Johnson in his discussion of Cowley. The term metaphysical has reference to the hair splitting subtlety of Donne's philosophical reasoning. Critics have tried to explain its precise meaning, but Dr. Johnson's explanation is the best. The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. Metaphysical poets copied neither nature nor life. Their thoughts are often new but seldom natural. They are not obvious, but neither are they just, and the reader, far from wondering that he missed them, wonders more frequently by what perversity of industry they were even found. So there were some pioneers of classicism, and these are most important. The pioneers of classicism are based on the major poets. The poets are such as Abraham Cowley, Denham, and Edmund Waller. So the affectionance, eccentricities, and fantasticism of John Donne and his metaphysical school provoked a reaction which led to the classicism of the next age. In fact, Ben Jonson was the real founder of the classical school, but probably because he, Johnson lacked smoothness, the honor of ushering in the new R, and he was assigned by the rising generation to a set of three poets of the mid 17th century, and those three poets were Abraham Cowley, Denham, Edmund Waller. So these poets are regarded as a link between the old and the new, between the Renaissance and the classical. They are the precursors or pioneers of the new age of John Dryden and Alexander Pope. So, firstly, we must talk about Abraham Cowley. So, Dr. Johnson began his book. Title is Lives of the Poets, and in this book, Dr. Johnson says कि Abraham Cowley is the last of the metaphysicals. He was the first of the moderns, leaving his earlier imitations of John Donne's subtleties and conceits. Cowley turned more and more towards classicism. He became a fervent admirer of Bacon, the Royal Society, as embodiments of reason and understanding. Uh, Cowley was an ambitious poet. He wrote an unsuccessful religious epic. The title of that epic is Davideis, Davideis. It wrote in irregular Pindaric ode, and Cowley's many love poems are occasional. Yes, Cowley wrote many love poems as well as occasional verses. In all, his distinguishing quality is brilliant wit rather than force of passion or imagination. Being a rather poor versifier, his verses are not very melodious. Despite these drawbacks, quite a few of his poems are dainty and graceful. Their pointed wit makes them memorable. In Collins' poem, the title of the poem is Drinking. In this poem, Drinking, he argues that since everything in nature drinks, such as the earth, the plant, the sun, the moon, the stars, etc., etc. In the poem, the epicure Colley says it is no use showering flowers, wines, and precious ointments on the monuments of the dead. He would have all these now while he is still alive. In the poem, the wish, W-I-S-H, wish, Cowley seeks the solitude of woods and fields away from the buzzing crowds of the city. And we find that Cowley was regarded as the greatest poet of his day, but his fame declined after a time. And Dryden said that though he must always be thought a great poet, he is no longer esteemed a good writer. This unfortunate remark has prejudiced all subsequent criticism of Cowley. uh, Ahead, we can say that about Denham. So Pope sang of Denham's strength and Waller's sweetness. Denham owes his fame to his poem Cooper's Hill. Denham composed the poem Cooper's Hill, and it is a description of a place near the Thames with many historical memories. The description is interspersed with moral and literary reflections, the most famous of which, adopted as their motto by the classist, is contained in these four lines. So, the balanced structure of the couplet, together with the antithetical style, gives to the poem a neatness and regularity of form far removed from the willful or careless laxity of the metaphysicals. And the last one is Edmund Waller in this poetry. So Edmund Waller was the pioneer of classicism. He was a writer of occasional verse. His sweetness impressed Pope consist in his well-tuned couplets, each of which is a complete sentence. He said he found English verse wanting in smoothness. He set himself the task of supplying it. He supplied it abundantly in miscellaneous poems, the most famous of which are his love poems. For example, on a girdle, Girdle, go, lovely rose, and last one is one on old age. Though the theme of the love poems is conventional, they are pretty and graceful. It is the poem on old age is the best and appealed most to men of the new generation. And here ahead, according to John Dryden, the beauty of rhyme was never fully known till Mr. Waller taught it. Uh, he first made writing easily an art, first showed us to conclude the sense most commonly in distinct. The new age cared for smoothness and correctness of form rather than originality or inspiration. Denham and Waller gave what it demanded. The new literature was called classical, but it was classical only on the side of restraint, the one thing needed at the time to curb the exuberant fancy of Spencer on the one hand and the exaggerated eccentricity of Donne on the other. The age of reason had arrived, and really the pioneers of classicism gave their devotion and contribution to develop the poetry. So ahead, we can talk on the Puritan age between 1603 to 1660. The we can say that here going to continue. So before that, I want to little bit 1 minute. Okay, so we are talking about John Milton between 1603 to 1660, and he composed so many famous verses. So we are discussing here John Milton as a, as a poet. Yes, so we must discuss about him. So talking about John Milton, John Milton's lifetime is 1608 to 1674. He was born in London on 9th December 1608. Milton's father was a lawyer come banker in easy circumstances, and though a Puritan, was a lover of art and literature. He was besides a noted musician. There can be no doubt that the young Milton inherited his love of music from his father, who spared no pains or expense in the boy's training. Milton was educated at St. Paul's School and Christ's College, Cambridge, because of his personal beauty, flowing hair, and a prudish aloofness from the righteous life of the undergraduates. Milton was called the Lady of Christ. Being of a rebellious temper, Milton was in trouble with the authorities over the curriculum. He was rusticated for a time. However, he took his BA in 1629, MA in 1632. While at Cambridge, Milton composed many Latin and Italian poems, but the only remarkable English poem of this period is his Ode on Christ's Nativity. Milton refused to be ordained a minister of the Church of England, uh, so he went to live at Horton. Horton is a place near London where his father had bought a property. Here he settled down to a life of hard study in order to prepare himself for writing a great poem. To this period belong his earlier poems, the twin pieces El Allegro and Second Penseroso. These two are masks. After that, Arcadus and Comus and the famous elegy Lycidas, composed by Milton in 1638. Milton left on a tour of the continent and spent most of his time in Italy, where his proficiency in Latin and Italian won him many friends. While Milton was preparing to proceed to Sicily, Sicily, and Greece, Greece, he received disturbing news from England. The struggle between king and parliament had come to a head, and Milton decided to hurry home, and that is very good. So, having returned to London after 15 months in August 1639, Milton first kept school teaching his two nephews. Uh, and we find that the result of his experience as a schoolmaster was his tract on education. This was a secondary interest, for he threw himself heart and soul into political and religious controversy. He pressed all his learning into the service of the parliamentary cause. During 20 years, between 1640 to 1660, John Milton was a journalist writing prose pamphlets. He wrote no poetry during this period, except a few sonnets. On the establishment of the Commonwealth, Milton was appointed Latin Secretary to the Department of Foreign Affairs, which office he held till the restoration of monarchy. In 1643, Milton married Mary Powell. And Mary Powell was a 17-year girl. She was a daughter of an Oxford royalist. But the marriage between John Milton and Mary Powell was unhappy. The philosophical seclusion and Puritan austerity of the Milton household must have bored the gay cavalier's daughter to death, and she left him shortly after the marriage. The aggrieved Milton wrote tracts pleading for a change in the divorce laws. The divorce laws were not changed, but his wife returned after 2 years, and Milton was not only reconciled to her, but Milton sheltered her family when it was in trouble after the ruin of the royalist cause. Though their relations were not happy, Mary Powell bore him three daughters. These daughters are alleged to have distressed Milton by their unfilial conduct, for they are said to have refused to read to him or take down his dictation of Paradise Lost. The highlight of Milton's secretaryship was his controversy with Salmasius, Salmasius, and Salmasius was a French scholar actually, and Salmasius was commissioned by Charles II to write a defense of his father, and he was an indictment of the regicide government. To this defense of the king, Milton replied with his defense of the English people. The controversy became hot and furious, and Milton, whose eyesight had been failing for some time now, became totally blind in 1652. And Milton continued his work with the help of Andrew Marvell and other assistants. His enemies took his calamity as God's judgment, but Milton accepted it with dignity and fortitude, which is reflected in his famous sonnet. The title of the sonnet is On His Blindness. In the meanwhile, his wife having died, he married a second time in 1656. His second wife's name was Catherine Woodcock, and his second wife died within 15 months. She is the late espoused saint of his sonnet. With the return of monarchy, Milton lost his post. He was arrested. By the intervention of powerful friends, he was released. He lost some of his property, but it is not clear whether it was confiscated or destroyed by the Great Fire of London in 1666. Undoubted, but John Milton resumed his private studies, and he had set himself to realizing the aspiration of his youth for writing an immortal epic poem. We do not know when it was begun, but Paradise Lost was published in 1667. Before this, Milton had married a third time, and his third wife's name was Elizabeth Mitchell. Survived him for over half a century. Paradise Regained and Samson Agnes Days were published together in 1671. The poet died on 8 November 1674. So, for much of the information about John Milton and his family, we are indebted to his nephews, whose names were John and Edward Phillips. His brother Christopher Milton became a Catholic. He was a judge in the reign of James II. This is interesting that Milton was never an orthodox Puritan. He was tolerant enough to live on good terms with a royalist father in law and Catholic brother. He had moved away from Presbyterians because of their intolerance of other sects and was latterly more allied to independents who ultimately got control over the parliament and established the republic. But he was not so liberal as to tolerate those who did not believe in the Bible as a divinely revealed book. In his latter life, he became an Arian. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. In personal character, Milton was as lofty as his verse. He was not insensitive to the charms of women or the joys of wine, but he deliberately kept aloof from such pleasures. He believes that they were unworthy of a man destined, as he himself was, for a great poetic mission. He was an incurable idealist, and to the end of his life never understood human nature in the raw. He had seen men only through the mirror of books and thought they were angels. Proud, self centered, and humorless, Milton believed He could reform man and regenerate England by preaching from a lofty tower. He lived to see his labor wasted and the causes he espoused defeated. The poor material reward he received for his great epic was perhaps symbolic of its fate. And now we must discuss about his poetry after his life. So his poetry was grand, famous worldwide, and in present era also it is so famous. So Milton's work falls naturally into four well-marked periods. So first is the Cambridge period, second the Horton period, third the journalistic period, and the last period is the greatest poetic achievement. The last period in which he composed the greatest epic in the world. The title of the epic is Paradise Lost. So first we will talk about a Cambridge period. So besides some English poems, John Milton wrote many poems in Latin and Italian in this era. The Latin and Italian poems can now be read in English translations. They are interesting exercises of a promising but immature genius. The most remarkable of these is his English Ode on Christ's Nativity. The poem Ode on Christ's Nativity is an excellent performance for a young man of 21, but it is hardly worth the extravagant praise lavished upon it by some enthusiasts. It speaks well of Milton's devotion to the person of the infant Christ, but is marred by exaggeration and conceits in Donne's manner. There is another next period is a Horton period. So leaving aside the insignificant mask Arcades, Arcades, the four pieces of this period are the most delightful of Milton's poetry. Had Milton written nothing else, his El Allegro and Pensereso, Camus and Lycidas would have been enough to place him in the front rank of English poets. The twin poems like El Allegro and Pensereso are Italian in title but English in spirit. Both poems present contrasted pictures of the scholarly Milton, first in his gayer and then in his graver mood. Written in tripping octosyllabic couplets, their haunting music is a permanent position. And ahead we can discuss about his famous poem Camus. It was presented at Ludlow Castle, Ludlow, in 1634 in honor of the Earl of Bridgewater on his appointment as Governor of Wales. John Milton called it simply a masque. The title subsequently given to it is rather misleading, for it suggests that Camus is the villain of the piece, and it is its hero too. It has been criticized for its lack of dramatic interest, but the criticism is irrelevant. The dramatic element in a masque is subordinate to spectacle and music. In Camus, even the spectacle is not so important as songs and speeches. Further, Camus is different from other masks in that it is frankly didactic. It is in fact a poem which celebrates the triumph of virtue, especially chastity. Camus would be hard to find an English poem which gives moral instruction with greater art. A young lady and her two brothers. So here is the story of Camus. But ahead we can discuss about that the opening speech of the attendant spirit in majestic blank verse is as lofty in tone as anything in Paradise Lost. And his next poem was Lycidas, and it is an elegy on a fellow student of Milton's whose name was Edward King. Edward King was drawn while on his way to Ireland. The form is that of the traditional pastoral elegy in which one shepherd mourns the death of another. King was intended for the church, and the thought that such a promising young career should be cut short makes Milton think of himself. He wonders whether it would not have been better for him to enjoy himself like others than to engage in incessant toil to achieve fame as a great poet. So, this was the greatness of John Milton, which we cannot can forget, and that is the greatness of John Milton. So after that, if we talk about the journalistic period, next period is a third one, and in this period, in this era, he composed sonnets to this period of 20 years between 1640 to 1660, belong to Milton's prose pamphlets, which are considered elsewhere, and a few sonnets. The sonnets are Italian in form and occasional in subject. For example, his attaining 23rd year, the assault on London, on his second wife, on his blindness, on the massacre in Piedmont, and uh, these are the examples of his sonnets. Unlike the Elizabethans, John Milton did not write love sonnets. John Milton's sonnets are as individual as his other works are. They are original, looped in thought, learned, and high sounding. Mm, as Wordsworth said, the sonnet in Milton's hand became a trumpet. And there is a last period, most important period, and in this era, John Milton was totally blind, and Milton produced the two greatest epic. First one is the Paradise Lost, and second one is Paradise Regained, and the last also one of the famous book which he we can say that composed or wrote, and the title of that book is Samson Agnestes. So at the beginning we will talk about the Paradise Lost. Yes, a detailed criticism about a Paradise Lost is not possible here, but something we will overall major points we will discuss about Paradise Lost. So the organ music of Paradise Lost is due principally to its blank verse is used in Paradise Lost. We can say that. And in it, Milton showed its potentialities in poetry, and since then, blank verse has been used as the normal vehicle of serious poetry. And ahead, we can say that Paradise Lost is a little read text, mm, and it is only the first two books of Paradise Lost that are usually prescribed for study. It is the most important. And ahead, if we want to talk about that, so that the last uh, really there is no word talking about a Paradise Lost, and there is a very nice quote about Paradise Lost that that quote is written by Dr. Johnson, the greatest scholar, the greatest epic. He says Paradise Lost is one of the books which the reader admires and lays down. It forgets to take up again. No one ever wished it longer than it is. Its pursuit is a duty rather than a pleasure. We read Milton for instruction, retire harassed and overburdened, and look elsewhere for recreation. We desert our master and seek for companions. And talking about Paradise Regained, it is epic to have been written as a sequel to Paradise Lost. Elwood is a Quaker friend when asked by Milton for his opinion on Paradise Lost. So Paradise Regained has been unduly depreciated, but is in no way inferior to Paradise Lost. So it is pitched in a lower key. It is simpler in style. It is on that account more congenial to read. One is thankful that its style is not as grand as Paradise Lost. Yes. So it is very nice. Both works, which really, what we can say is that grand works are there. The last work that is also very important. Samson Agnestes. Yes, really, Samson Agnestes. So it is the last work written by Milton, and after it means it is a tragedy on the Greek model of Sophocles and Achilles. It is written in blank verse of a looser type with occasional rhymes in the choruses. The unities are strictly observed. The action takes just one day and is confined to one place. However, it has little movement or progress. For three fourths of it is simply a string of dialogues interspersed with choruses. It is only towards the end that something like a plot is discernible. It should be remembered that the play Samson Agnestes was not meant for the stage. Milton had no dramatic gift, and Samson Agnestes, though cast in a dramatic form, is only an extended lyrical poem. And if you want to talk about Samson Agnestes, so the Samson Agnestes deals with the last part of the life of Samson, the Israelite hero whose story is given in the book of Judges in the Old Testament. The play opens with Samson blind and prisoner of the Philistines at Gaza. So this was very short, and really it was become so much famous, and the characteristic about which we must talk. But I think that really talking about his characters, Milton's poetry is features very important point, which about we must speak little bit. So we find the combination of two cultures such as humanism and Puritanism in his works. As a humanist scholar, Milton was a lover of Hellenic art and beauty, and as a Puritan scholar, Milton was fired with the religious zeal of a Hebrew prophet. These two cultures are incompatible and hard to reconcile. That Milton should have succeeded in synthesizing them to a degree never attained before or since, not even Spencer. So, Milton was a remarkable achievement. The subject matter of his poems is religious, but the art forms he employed to express his Puritan philosophy are those of the Renaissance. And there's some these are some major features related with the John Milton. And really, if we want to speak about John Milton, so it is we don't have words. As, and really, that this great master, grand master, mm, composed those greatest works, which uh, which light was spread in the entire universe. And here we can conclude the Milton's poetry. And at the next point, we should talk about the prose. So I want to take a little bit short break, and after a short break, we will talk about the prose in the Puritan age. Hello. So we are going to continue the lecture series. Now we will talk about the prose in the Puritan age between 1603 to 1660. And while the poetry of this period shows a falling off from the Elizabethan, this is not the case with its prose. The prose of the reign of the first two Stuarts and of the Commonwealth is not only superior to its poetry, it marks a distinct advance on the prose of the Elizabethan period. Generally speaking, it continued to be quaint and highly poetic in manner, but this period became more ornate with the wealth of learning and grave melancholy musing that were so characteristics of this age. In the hands of such writers as Thomas Browne, Taylor, and Milton, English prose touched heights which have not been approached since. But this is not the whole account of the matter. Side by side, there arose a new prose of the plainer kind, approaching that of the Restoration and therefore modern in the writings of Hobbes, Clarendon, and Isaac Walton. While religion was the dominant interest of the time, and it is widely reflected in its writings, prose extended its sphere by embracing a greater variety of subjects such as history, biography, philosophy, antiquities, sports, and character. The great prose classics of this period are the authorized version of the Bible, uh, Brown's Religio Medici, Thomas Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, and Walton's Complete Angler. For a more detailed consideration of the great prose writers of this period, each convenient division would be to classify them as ornate and plain. The minors and unclassed will be noticed at the end. The authorized version of the Bible stands quite apart, being the work not of one but of about 50 writers, as it is the earliest as well as the most important book of this page. It should be taken up first, and that is the authorized version of the uh, Bible, and it is most important. In considering this, the greatest monument of religious prose in the English language, it would be helpful to give a brief resume of all the previous translations which were used in preparing it. The scriptures had been translated in England from the earliest Anglo Saxon times, but the first regular translation was that made by Wycliffe in the 14th century. His translation was from St. Jerome's Latin version of the Bible known as the Vulgate. The Tudor humanist ambition was to translate the scripture direct from the original Hebrew and Greek. Tyndale, who was first in the field, translated the New Testament and part of the Old in a popular style which fixed the standard for all subsequent translations of the Bible. He was followed by Coverdale, whose complete translation, known as the Great Bible, was issued in 1540. It is also known as Cranmer's Bible because it contained a preface by the Archbishop. Some Protestant divines who had fled from Mary's persecution and settled in Geneva issued their own translation, which came to be known as the Geneva Bible in 1560. It was based on Tyndale and Coverdale, and although it was scholarly and became very popular, it was never adopted to be read in churches because of its Calvinistic origin. In 1568 appeared a new translation generally known as the Bishop's Bible from the fact that the majority of its 13 translators were bishops. It was this Bible which was used in churches when King James ascended the throne. In 1604, the king called a conference at Hampton Court to consider the demands of the Puritan party. One of the Puritan objections was that the renderings of the Bible read in English churches were faulty. So, by the king's command, a band of 47 eminent scholars was appointed to undertake a new and revised translation. This, known as the Authorized Version, appeared in 1611. It is so called not because it was authorized by an act of parliament, but because it captured the imagination and affection of the people. Of course, the authority of the king who commanded its preparation may also have something to do with The title in preparing in the bishop's Bible was taken as the base, while all the other previous translations, including the Geneva version, were consulted. The result was a most felicitous blend of the old and the new indiction, and a prose rhythm which, especially in lyrical parts such as the Psalms, Psalms, and the prophets, the Psalms and the prophets reflects the imaginative and emotional intensity of Oriental poetry. The style is popular and dignified, and its slightly archaic vocabulary and phrasing gives it a touch of quaintness that is so appropriate and charming. Uh, we find that the influence of authorized version on English thought and speech cannot be overestimated, and it was really so. If we want to talk about the writers of ordinary prose, such as Robert Burton, Sir Thomas Browne, Jeremy Taylor, John Milton, so they also contributed uh, their time for the development of prose in the Puritan age. At the first, we will talk about Robert Burton. So, Robert Burton's lifetime is 1577 to 1640. Burton was a clergyman. He resided permanently at Oxford. Of a brooding and melancholic temper, Burton was a bookworm who devoured the libraries of Oxford. He wrote The Anatomy of Melancholy to relieve his depression. The book was published in 1621. He went through several editions with additions and alterations in his own lifetime. It is one of the most curious and entertaining of books. It has established itself as a classic of English literature. Dr. Johnson kept it as a bedside book. It influenced, among others, such as Sterne and Lamb. The book treats of the causes, symptoms, and cure of melancholy, or rather, the disease called melancholia, which is now attributed to a bad liver. The two cheap types of melancholy dealt with are love melancholy and religious melancholy. There are two types of melancholy: love and religious. Uh, so this is about the book Anatomy of Melancholy, and really, and after that there was another writer, Sir Thomas Browne, whose lifetime was 1605 to 1682. He was the greatest prose writer of the century. He exhibits the same qualities of quaintness, profound learning, grave meditation, and quiet humor. He has the added charm of a style which, for its dreamy cadence, has no parallel in English. And ahead, if we want to talk about him, uh, by profession, a doctor, Thomas Browne was doctor by profession. He was a strange amalgam of scientist, scholar, antiquary, and mystic. After taking his MA at Oxford, Browne studied medicine in France, Italy, and finally in Holland, where he took his MD at Leiden, Leiden. Browne settled at Norwich, where he practiced medicine for the rest of his life. Besides a large practice, Browne had many scientific and antiquarian interests and carried on correspondence with learned antiquaries of England and the continent. Though a scientist, Browne was not free from the general credulity of the age. When invited to give his expert opinion in a trial in which two unfortunate women stood charged with the capital offense of practicing witchcraft, he solemnly testified against them. His declaration of belief in witches and witchcraft influenced the jury, and the poor women were condemned to death. This is shocking to the moderns, but it must be remembered that belief in witches was almost universal in the Brownies' day. The science of the 17th century was a primitive affair, and Brownie believed not only in witches and devils but in astrology, magic, alchemy, and other superstitions. Brownie was knighted in 1671 and he was died on his 17th birthday, October 19, 1682. And his work name is Vulgar Errors, and it was so bulky work, and it is a discursive account of the errors and superstitions not only of the vulgar but also of the learned. It seeks to expose such popular errors. um, and his next work was Hydriotaphia, and this work was inspired by the discovery of some sepulchral nurse in the neighborhood. Sepulchuralnus. Hadriotaphia starts with a discussion of the various ancient modes of burial, leading to a lofty meditation on Brown's favorite subject, such as death and oblivion. This little treatise of about 50 pages affords the best example of Brown's melancholy mysticism, couched in a style that remains unsurpassed for its verbal music in the whole range of English prose literature. Though less popular than Religio Medici, it is his masterpiece, and it is the quaintness of his thought and style. There is his next work is The Garden of Ceres, written by Thomas Browning. Sorry, it's written by yes, Thomas Browning. So it was printed with Hadrotapia, uh, and it deals with quincunx or arrangement in five, like the five of playing cards. It starts with a story put out by Xenophon, Xenophon, that the garden of the Persian Emperor Cyrus was planted in quincunxes, Quincunxes. Brownie proceeds to hunt out quincunxes everywhere on earth, and in heaven he becomes fascinated with the number of five, which acquires a mystic significance. The reader is bewildered in the maze of quincunxes, which threw poor Coleridge almost into a fit of hysterics, so that he saw quincunxes in heaven above, quincunxes in earth below, quincunxes in the mind of man, quincunxes in tones, in optic nerves, in roots of trees, in leaves, in everything. The book, like its company Hydrotopia, was simply an occasion for displaying the author's vast learning. The book, The Garden of Ceres, provides a good illustration of the humorous quaintness of the 17th century. There was a next book. The title of that was A Letter to a Friend and Christian Morals. These are interconnected, uh, and we find that in any critical consideration of them, it must be remembered that they are not corrected by Browning. Both books are A Letter to a Friend and Christian Morals, and we find that the letter starts with a late description of a TB patient with details of the changes brought by approaching death, passes to thought and feelings of the dying man, and ends with moral reflections and precepts. These reflections and precepts, in an expanded form, make up the subject matter of Christian morals, though less distinguished than the others. In point of style, these pieces are nevertheless of the same order and are specially characteristics of Browning's role as a preacher. Because of this, they have close affinities with Religio Medici, and the student will do well to read them along with it. Christian morals has been unduly depreciated by some modern critics who think they are about Christian or other morals. It is significant that the treatise was edited by the great 18th century moralist Dr. Johnson. And yeah, we will talk about the greatest text, that the title of the text written by Sir Thomas Browne. That text was Religio Medici. It means the religion of a doctor. It appeared in 1642. It became immediately popular. It was translated into Latin, French, German, Dutch, and Italian. Religio Medici was reprinted about 8 times during the author's lifetime. Since then, it has gone through many editions and become an established classic. Brownie wrote the book with the aim of defending himself from the traditional charge that doctors were atheists. Brownie's confession of faith reveals him as a scientist who is also a devout Christian. Religion is not incompatible with science. Brownie was very conscious of the limits of reason. Spiritual truths, he says, spiritual truths are above reason. Faith consists in believing a thing not only above but contrary to reason and against the arguments of our proper senses. The use of reason, which Brownie restricts to the non essential of religion. In unimportant matters, the superficialities and accretions which frequently pass for religion, he is free to be skeptical in regard to this. Browne declares every man's own reason is his best Oedipus. Wow, what a line! Every man's own reason is nice line. And we will talk about the Jeremy Taylor. So he was the most eloquent of Anglican divines. He was the son of a barber. He was favored by Lord Laud. He became chaplain to the king. Taylor's liberty of professing is a plea for toleration in matters of faith. Taylor is famous for his sermons and his holy living and holy dying. His style is highly rhetorical and rhythmical, rich in fancy and classical learning, gentle and urban. It is enlivened with picaresque descriptions of nature. The musical and pictorial beauties of his prose are offset to some extent by the enormous length of his sentences, their involved syntax and Latinisms, faults which he shares with Milton. He has the habit of beginning many of his similes with stock formula, so have I seen, which becomes irritating after a time. So that was so the pomp of day, the skylark, which composed by Jeremy Taylor. So the last one, that is personality, that is John Milton. He was the greatest poet as well as he was one of the greatest prose writers also. So the writer of Paradise Lost was not only a great poet, he was also a great prose writer. I have already told you. A great deal of the matter of his numerous political and ecclesiastical pamphlets is merely journalistic, and being controversial in character is marred by peevishness, violence, and partisan bias. The only interest of these controversial writings is the element of self revelation and magnificent burst of eloquence scattered through them. The greatness of Milton's prose belongs to his style. In any consideration of this style, it must be remembered that Milton was not in his element in prose. His native element was poetry. He regarded prose as an inferior instrument of expression and his prose work as that of his left hand. It was imposed on him as a duty, moreover, as Latin secretary to the government. It was his business habitually to write in Latin. Internal controversies alone forced him to write in English. After in episcopal and diverse pamphlets he published in 1644. His tract on education and the most eloquent of all his prose pieces, Aeropagitica. It is a noble and impassioned plea for liberty of the press, which continues even today to be a living topic throughout the world. Milton's style is highly poetical. In its basic character, it is the style of an orator, lofty, impassioned, and rhythmical. Its faults are as obvious as its beauties. They are common more or less to all the ornate writers of the age. Milton cannot organize his sentences, which, apart from their Latin syntax, are monstrously long, and he wrote the tract on education and Areopagitica. So really, but the next point, the writers of plain prose, and really we must discuss about this one, writers of plain prose. So first one is Thomas Hobbes, whose lifetime is 1588 to 1679. He was the great political theorist of the 17th century. He was a nobleman's tutor and later of the Prince of Wales, who became Charles II. His small treatise of human nature appeared in 1650. He was followed in 1651 by his most famous philosophical work, Leviathan. So that is work, and Hobbes also denied freedom of will in his letter upon liberty and necessity. Hobbes was a profound and original thinker, and his political and ethical theses provoked a storm of protest. Almost all philosophical writers for the next 100 years devoted themselves to the task of refuting his doctrines. Hobbes was a master of English prose in the plain style, his turn logic supported by interesting illustrations, his precise diction and brevity due to his prose force. And talking about the next one, that person is Lord Clarendon, Edward Hyde Lord Clarendon, whose lifetime was 1609 to 1674. He was a lawyer. He rose to be chief minister of Charles II, being thoroughgoing conservative and bigoted Anglican. Uh, he opposed Charles' toleration of the Catholics and Puritans. He became unpopular. The secret marriage of his daughter to the king's Catholic brother incensed his own party, who suspected him of connivance. The plague, the Great Fire of London, and the Dutch War completed his ruin. His book name was History of the Rebellion. It began in 1646. It was published posthumously. It is a defense of Charles I and the royalist cause, and is not impartial. But whatever its defects and history, its merits as literature are undeniable. What Hobbes did for philosophy, Clarendon did for history. Yes, very nice. The styliness of his prose, his narrative skill, his vivid description, and above all his penetrating portraits of character have made his history a classic of literature. The faults of his style are obvious, their prolixity and awkward syntax, but neither is as tiring as in Taylor or Milton. In fact, Clarendon's style is midway between the ornate of the Elizabethan and the plain of the next age. And character of Lord Falkland, very nice. He was written. So after that, there was Isaac Walton. Yes. So he was a small tradesman in London who had a passion for fishing. He was acquainted with the clergymen of his day and was fond of literature and literary men. His intimate biographies of John Donne, Sir Henry Wotton, Hooker, and Bishop Sanderson show his simplicity and hero worship, but his fame rests on his Complete Angler. Isaac Walton wrote Complete Angler. Yes, it is a book. It is a book of general recreation that appeals to all anglers and non-anglers. It is in the form of dialogue between the author, Pescator, who is a fisherman, and his disciple, Venator, who is a hunter. Uh, it's very nice book or text is there. So the entire discourse is delivered in homely, garrulous, yet dignified style that matches well with its matter, like Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Isaac Walton's Complete Angler is an antique in English literature and a more rarefied one. Isaac Walton himself described it as a recreation of recreation. Oh, very nice. Uh, really, recreation of recreation. So here was this one, Isaac Walton. There was some. After that, there was a person whose name was Pescator was not there actually, so it was just given. But the last one, minor writers, minor prose writers. So talking about minor prose writers, we find that Fuller, Urquhart, Urquhart, Harrington, Seldon, Seldon, and the character writers Thomas Fuller. Mm. If we talk about Thomas Fuller is the most noteworthy of these. A clergyman noted for his sermons, he rose to be chaplain to Charles II, but he died before he could be rewarded with a bishopric. His two well-known works, Thomas Fuller's two well-known works are Holy and Frequent State. This is first one. Worthies of England. This is second one. The Worthies is a collection of biographies of the illustrious sons of which afforded example scope for their wit. The next one, personality minor writer is Bishop Hall. He was the satirist. He was the first in this field with his text. The title of his text is Characters of Virtues and Vices. He was followed by Sir Thomas Overbury, whose characters appeared in 1640, a year after his full Murder in the Tower. But the most famous collection of characters was written by John Earl, who later became a bishop. Bishop Hall's Microcosmography, which subtitle is A Piece of the World Discovered in Essays and Characters. The work appeared in 1628 and it was very nice work that. So in this way there was we discuss about writers of plain prose in the Puritan age, and here really concluded the Puritan age. So we have completed the entire Puritan age. So here I want to say you thank you, see you.